Going live. Hey, what's up, Isolation Nation? Hope everyone is doing okay considering everything that's going on. I thought I would jump on and bring on some expertise into what's happening at the top level and what's happening around government and movements at that level, because I know there's been a lot of questions around around what's happening at the top level and how that feeds down into the wider community. So today on the show, we have the leader of the ACT Party, also MP for Epsom, and more recently, part of the Epidemic Response Committee, David Seymour. How are you?
Hey, Jace. Look, thanks heaps for having me on your show, and really looking forward to getting into the discussion.
How's the brain at the moment? I know you've been busy with everything that's going on and all the meetings that you're having. This is sort of crisis response, I guess. How's the feeling at the moment on your end?
Oh, look, I think probably I'm like a lot of people where the first week of this, it was a bit crazy and everything was changing and it wasn't clear what things would be like. And over time, we've sort of almost got into this being normal life, right? So it's going to be a bit weird when we can like go out and be free again. And yet, clearly every day we've got new ideas and new information about what the real data is around the virus, what the effect of the lockdown has been on the economy, and so on. So new information, and that leads to new ideas about what should New Zealand look like pulling out of this thing. In some ways it may be an opportunity. Not saying that we don't have to get things right as far as the pandemic response first, but quite exciting to think about how we might come out of this.
For sure. So for those people who aren't so savvy with how the workings of government work and what happens in Parliament, what happens normally and how has that changed compared to what's going on today with the background situation with COVID-19 that's shaken up everything from
it sure has. So,
government.
Probably the biggest thing to understand is that in New Zealand, the government and Parliament are two totally different things, even though members of the government are also members of the Parliament, and we sit side by side. So one way to look at it is that in the United States, they have the Congress and the Senate. They're at one end of the National Mall, and then all the way along the National Mall, you get to the White House. So you've got the Parliament, or the legislative part of American government. What happens is that the government sits in Parliament, and those of us who are parliamentarians who are not in government, we ask questions at question time and generally try to give the public a channel for being represented, giving their feedback, asking questions, getting information, all of that sort of stuff. Is what we parliamentarians do, ultimately hoping to give people the proposition that if more people voted for us, they'd have a better government. What's happened through this crisis is that Parliament has stopped sitting in its normal physical way, and yet those same functions have continued through other means. So we've had this Epidemic Response Committee, and the Epidemic Response Committee has been making trying to perform the role of question time. So we've been getting in the ministers, we've been asking them questions, and generally just trying to, get the idea across to people that, maybe that while we generally support the strategy and it is a time that a certain amount of unity is needed for the strategy to work, that doesn't mean everything the government's done is right, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't criticize them.
Yeah, right. What powers do the government have during times like these? This is an extreme scenario that we all find ourselves in. What can they do now that they haven't been able to do prior and when business is as usual?
Yeah, so we're really lucky that we've inherited quite a lot of legal infrastructure for times like this. So the Epidemic Preparedness Act, which was passed, I think, in 2006, the Public Health Act, which I think was 1956, these acts give very special powers to government for a limited period of time when there's an epidemic. So back on the 25th of March, the Prime Minister brought down an epidemic preparedness notice, which lasts for 3 months, if I remember rightly. And that gives the Director General of Health, quite incredible powers to set rules and regulations to prevent the spread of the epidemic. Interestingly, there was a bit of confusion at first because the Prime Minister was basically trying to govern the conference by media conferences and press releases. And on the Epidemic Response Committee, we said, look, you actually have to write the rules down. You can't just arrest people, because you think it's the right thing to do. So we saw the Director General of Health issue a special notice under the Health Act, explaining what you can and can't do. And it's really important those laws are written down. Under the Epidemic Preparedness Acts, the government, as opposed to Parliament, can actually change laws just by saying, we'd like this law changed. So that's really quite extraordinary. Normally, you've got to go through Parliament to get a law changed, but again, it's temporary. Really great powers given to the government. Parliament is less powerful at times like this, but it's only temporary.
And so those law changes are just for these 3 months, or they carry on after that period?
No, it's all time limited. And so I think it's a really important, principle that things that are done in the name of fighting the epidemic are only done for the period that's relevant. So, for example, the $25 benefit increase for people on unemployment or job seeker support or sole parent benefit, I think that was really wrong. Now, if we want to have a debate about what benefit levels should be, sure, let's have that debate any time. However, I think it's really important that we don't slip through stuff under the guise of the epidemic that really is about a particular politician's long-term goals. And the way to achieve that is to make sure that epidemic policies are time limited to the 3 months initially that we have these measures in place.
And so how much, I guess, of the public's funds can Parliament or government access at the moment while we're in this 3 month period? Is there a limit, and how can they use that? Is there restrictions around it?
So one of the really important principles that underlies our whole society and democracy is no taxation without representation. So the government cannot spend taxpayer money unless it has an act of Parliament to allow it to do that expenditure. So typically what happens is we have a budget cycle. The Parliament brings down a budget in May, and there's what's called an appropriation bill that gives the permission of the House of Representatives to spend taxpayers' money. The government saw that it was probably going to need more money than anticipated when this crisis hit. So Parliament actually voted through a bill that gave them the ability to spend up to $52 billion in the 3 months from April to June. So huge amounts of money. I mean, it's kind of fun to think about how much $52 billion actually is. If you take $100 notes and you stack them up, let's say 100 of them is a centimeter, and 1 million of them is a meter. So $100 million dollars a meter. I think it's $1 million a meter. Then 1,000 meters is $1 billion. So $1 billion is a 1 kilometer high pile of $100 notes. We did 52 of them. So if you can imagine a 52 kilometer high pile of $100 notes with Sir Ernest Rutherford on them, that's pretty much what Parliament signed off for the government to spend in 3 months. Thankfully, they haven't spent it all yet.
How much has the government used so far?
Look, it's pretty hard to keep up. Part of it is their normal expenditure, which would be about $25 billion for that period. But then we can look at some of the stuff they've done. So about 10 billion on the wage subsidy, that's all extra. A lot more people will be on the unemployment benefit. That'll be extra. A lot more on the business guarantee. That was supposedly about 6 billion. Then there's mortgage relief. So I doubt anyone could give you an exact number right now, but it will be in the order of an additional 20 or 30 billion dollars spent since this crisis began.
So what happens if we reach that 52 billion threshold? Is there a way of getting access to more, or do taxes rise? What happens?
It's illegal for the government to spend your taxpayers' money without an act of Parliament permitting it. No taxation without representation. So if Parliament doesn't sit again before the end of June, I don't know what happens. I guess the government just won't be able to pay anybody. It'll be a little bit like what they have in the States, where they have a government shutdown, where Congress basically just votes not to give the government any more money and they all have to go home. We won't get to that. Parliament will sit on the 28th of April, and the government will introduce a new budget. I expect in the middle of next month.
All right. So we're starting to see, I guess, the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of isolation. We've heard of when we're going into level 3 for 2 weeks, and then after that, who knows? The health problem is starting to come down a bit, and we're managing that risk. But obviously, there's the economic risk that we have to come to the forefront of. What do you think that looks like over the next 6 months?
Yeah, so I think you're totally right. First of all, the cost of the virus, or the risk of the virus, is clearly less than we thought. So the Prime Minister said if we do nothing, tens of thousands of people will die. Even the worst countries haven't had anything like that. I think New Zealand currently has 1,400 cases and 14 deaths, and the curve had already started flattening as the lockdown was introduced. So, that really, I think is not quite right. I think when it comes to, so I think that the risk posed by the virus is not as great as it was sold to us.
To New Zealand specifically, or globally?
I think every country's got this problem, but I can only really comment on New Zealand. The Prime Minister said tens of thousands of people would die. I don't think really there was any plausible scenario, given what we know now about the virus in general, and especially in New Zealand, where that would happen. Similarly, Australia, much lighter lockdown, not even close to that many deaths. So those are the basic issues that we face with the virus. Secondly, I don't think anyone really anticipated what it would mean to lock down an economy the way that we have. Even I underestimated it. The ACT Party newsletter 4 weeks ago said, look, we're just going to hibernate the economy for 3 weeks. What's the big deal? In reality, business and human activity are all intricately interconnected. So as a result, once you knock down one domino, the whole thing goes down like a house of cards. And there's massive pain out there in the business world, where people can't pay their leases. Landlords can't pay their banks. Banks are starting to pull up the anchors on credit, and all of a sudden you get a crunch. But then that moves over into the sort of social world, where people are having real mental health problems and real stress and relationship breakdown and domestic violence, related in part to being locked up, but also related to the economic stress they're facing. So, I think we underestimated how sensitive the world is to this kind of government intervention. So that's kind of the second thing that we learned. Now, if we know that the virus is not as bad as we thought, and the lockdown is worse than we thought, then the right thing to do is to actually change the balance between the lockdown measures and the virus it's supposed to be controlling. And I think the government has been, frankly, a bit slow to be nimble. So, I support the general approach. I think they could have been a bit more nimble in adjusting their course once new information became clear.
Yeah, right. There you highlighted a lot of points about what's to come economically. What solutions are being talked about in the epidemic response team at the moment?
Well, look, there's two basic answers. One that a lot of people on the left would like is, well, clearly the government's going to have to do more stuff. The government's going to get involved, and the government's going to build roads and invest in new technologies, and this is going to be a world where we have a lot more government intervention. I think that would be a huge mistake, and fundamentally, it's a mistake because government has done a terrible job of being prepared for and managing this crisis. I'm not saying that's a problem with a particular politician. I think all around the world, governments of all stripes have had this problem. But fundamentally, outside of a few countries like Taiwan, governments have been really, really hopeless at managing the pandemic. And so we've all just had to stay home, which has been a really blunt way of fighting the pandemic. Very expensive way of fighting the pandemic too. So if fundamentally it's a government failure and we're staying in lockdown for an extra 5 days, which is costing $1 billion a day because the government can't do contact tracing or isn't ready to do contact tracing, what does that tell you about the role of government? Does it tell you that government should be doing more stuff? Government should be building more infrastructure projects and investing in more businesses and generally trying to run the economy more tightly? No, it tells you, if you learn anything from this crisis, is that we actually need government to do less if we want to grow our way out of this rapidly.
I guess that ties in quite nicely to Paulus's question. Thoughts around government plans to increase government spending or debt? Should we be changing our economic philosophy? I guess that answered it a little bit. Do you want to go a little deeper into his question?
Well, I just say that what was good economic policy advice before this crisis is still good economic policy advice now. So you want government to do things that only government can do, and then do it really well. So, fighting public pandemics is a really good example of that. Governments should provide a police force, an army, courts of law, should run monetary policy in a way that gives you sound money. They should manage trade relationships with other governments. These are all the things that governments can do that allow people to grow their businesses, create jobs, higher paying jobs, and generally get us out of this economic funk. If government tries to do a whole lot of other stuff, then we're going to end up being much poorer.
Question from Andy Reid now. Do you think the government will raise income tax or GST? Thanks, Andy.
Well, we've already started doing some modelling for the budget because we'll do an alternative budget, and we show that the government could get out of this and be back in surplus by 2024 without raising taxes if it chooses to. But that involves being pretty disciplined on a whole lot of expenditures. So, this is not a time to have election bribes like fees-free uni. It's not a time to maintain this winter energy payment, which was another election bribe. It's not a time to maintain this $25 increase in benefits, which, if anything, is just going to ensure that people are less likely to look for work at the margin. So these are things that need to be reduced when it comes to expenditure. If you do that, then you can get back to surplus by 2024 without having to raise taxes. But if the government was to raise taxes, then the right thing to do would be to raise the bottom rate and the 30-cent rate. So you've got two rates of 17.5 and 33. That would give you quite a lot more revenue and a much simpler tax system.
Just jumping sideways slightly, for the election, this has quite a few implications, not so much on what people are going to be promoting for their campaigns, but are we going to see a delayed election, do you think?
It's way too early to say what the election date might be because you've got to work out with any decision what are the things that you'd have to know. So you're going to have to know what alert level New Zealand will be in for about 3 months before the election, so from sort of late June through to late September. And you're going to have to know what that alert level looks like. So I think at this point, you'd say it's probably likely that New Zealand will be at level 2 by the start of June, or at least by mid-June. And second of all, we got to know, what will life be like at level 2? Will people realistically be able to have election campaigns? So those are the questions that you've got to ask. And at the moment, we don't know what level we're going to be at or what it will really look like and whether it'll feel like an environment where we can have an election campaign. I think we'll know by the start of June whether we're going to have an election in September, but we won't know before that.
What happens if politicians or potential politicians can't carry out an effective election campaign? Does that mean things will get delayed?
Well, I think one thing that's absolutely clear, and I do trust Jacinda Ardern and the others who, are at heart New Zealanders who want us to be a democracy. It would be totally unacceptable to run an election in unfair conditions where it's not possible to have a proper campaign. It's just absolutely unthinkable that New Zealand would have an election that was not free and fair. I mean, we kind of feel sorry for and pity countries that don't have proper elections. We can't possibly have an election where there's any question that it was not free and fair. And a free and fair election means, everyone's got to be able to campaign on an equal footing.
Yeah, right. Going to, I guess, what requirements must be met for international travel to start up again from the top level? Do we need to see COVID-free within New Zealand and then people can start leaving? And do we need to see vaccines to allow people to start coming in? How does that all work?
So one of the most important things the New Zealand government can do in the next week, the next month, and the next year is get really good. Like, we got to be the best in the world at having a border that people can go through, but viruses can't. So what does that mean? It means really good testing, really good tracing, so that if somebody does try to go through the border that has it, we know really quickly and we can isolate them and anyone else they may have contacted in order to prevent an outbreak. So we need to get back to a world where tourists and international students can go in and out of New Zealand as fast as possible, even if it, for instance, starts out as just being from a small number of countries, maybe even just Australians being able to ski in Queenstown this winter will be make or break for a lot of businesses. And you could come up with examples up and down the country of that kind of thing. So we need to get really good at testing and tracing at the border so that, we don't end up isolated from the rest of the world and we can keep doing business but not have an outbreak.
How close do you think we are to that point? Gut feeling, I know it's quite a long way off, but has there been any talk around the committee around what that could look like in the future?
I don't think anyone really knows. If the government has any work going on that, then they're not sharing it. If they don't, then that's a real worry. But you look at what Emirates are doing. They now have apparently a blood test where 15 minutes, you get to the gate, they take a finger prick of your blood, they test it, and if you're clear, you can fly. If you're not clear, then you can't fly, and that they know within 15 minutes. So that's the kind of technology that New Zealand's going to have if we're going to have borders that are open enough for our economy to function and safe enough that we don't get viral outbreaks in the middle of winter.
Do we have enough infrastructure here where we could almost shut ourselves off to the rest of the world and thrive as a community 1, 2, 3 years down the line, do you think, if it comes to that?
So could New Zealand function without global links?
Yeah. Without physical global links. If the rest of the world can't control the virus in their countries, can we be a safe haven for New Zealanders, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's possible. It's just a question of at what cost. So if you look at people trying to build interesting businesses in New Zealand, they almost always end up with foreigners. You think about companies that are really interesting to work for, that they're filled with people who weren't born in New Zealand, and it makes sense. I mean, there's 7 billion people or 8 billion people in the world, and someone said you've got to start a business, but you can only hire from a pool of 5 million out of 8 billion. You say, well, that's just nuts. I mean, it's like, there's 1,600 people in a room and you can only hire one of them. Is basically what you're saying. So of course we're going to have talent. And I think also, as far as a lot of our exports are actually experiences, so tourist experiences and education experiences, those are going to need to open up as well. So we could carry on. I mean, New Zealand will still exist, and you could still live here, but it's going to be a much poorer and less interesting business if you don't have, less interesting country if you don't have global links.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you there. What do you think the new normal looks like in 5 years' time for New Zealand once we've gotten out of the immediate hurdles?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that in 5 years' time, COVID-19 probably will be a very distant memory. It'll be easily vaccinated, and B, that there will be a lot better technology for managing it. So I think we'll kind of look back at it as, well, it was very expensive. We were very underprepared, but we'll buy, and we needed to learn from that. But by and large, it'll be pretty distant in 5 years' time.
Will it be back to business as usual? Are you like what we were 6 months ago, or do you think?
Yeah, I think by and large it will be. Of course, it's difficult to understand what sort of changes will be accelerated as a result of this. So, online shopping. I think people's work habits. It's going to be really hard for bosses to say no to a day working from home after this. So there'll be cultural and technological changes that, if you are in the office space business, well, there might be less demand for office space. Ditto retail. Westfield have just built this enormous mall in Newmarket in the middle of the Epsom electorate. It's amazing. I don't know if it may turn out to be bad timing for them. I suspect they've already thought about it. So hard to know about some of those trends in consumer sentiment. I do think what's really interesting is the effect that it's going to have on the psychology of Generation Z, the Zoomers and maybe millennials too, because you sort of grow up and then there's the GFC and then there's this massive setback. So, unlike the baby boomers who are just all sex, drugs and rock and roll for their whole life, you've now got a generation that is more like the boomers' parents and grandparents who, sort of had a big war and then 20 years later another big war. And so you have to wonder if, we're not going to have a generation that has quite different attitudes from the ones that were immediately before it and more like their great-grandparents.
Yeah, it's quite a good point you raise about what the next 20 years means for the generations of today. It's going to be a lot tougher on the millennials, the Gen Zs, making sure that they can thrive collectively, because it will be a lot. It'll be harder going, won't it? It'll be harder to make a buck. We'll be stuck with a lot of debt. What are the solutions, I guess, at an individual level, but also at a regional level, a national level, to make sure that everyone can come out of this relatively unscathed?
Well, first of all, there might be an opportunity to accelerate some of the policy debates that we've had. So one of the biggest injustices that's happened to millennials and Zoomers is just the fact that, they're going to basically find $1 million to buy a house. And that's just totally ridiculous. So, there may be a correction there anyway. and there may be policy reforms that mean that it gets easier to build a house, and that may be a massive payoff for younger generations. I think if there is a 15 or 20% correction, it would be totally wrong for a government policy to try and constrain the supply of housing or loosen up finance just to get those asset prices back up to ridiculous levels again. So, look, I think that's one area where younger generations may actually do pretty well out of this. I think also, the options for more choice in education, those are really interesting opportunities, because clearly we've seen that you don't have to do things the way you used to do it. So why shouldn't people be able to take out their share of the education funding and take it to a virtual school, a private school, one that better suits their lifestyle and learning? So look, I think potentially you see some policy debates accelerated, but actually, for the most part, what was good advice before this is still good advice. So, for younger people, if you can save $10 when you're 21, then that's almost as good, if not better, than saving $100 when you're 31. So, if you can get yourself a good financial base, be disciplined, learn how to live happily without spending too much, then your life's going to be a lot easier. You're going to have more savings and you're going to have more options. And the great thing about that advice is that I don't know what's going to happen in 5 years, but that's going to be true whatever. Like there's a world war or, a mass pandemic that kills 1 billion people, like whatever happens, you're going to be better off if you have made prudent preparations to have a good financial base, i.e. saving.
Yeah, right. This is focusing more on what's happening globally. Do you think because there's been this big event that's affected the whole world, everyone's been put into lockdown, there's going to be recessions all over the place, where and for some gnarly times, do you think that because of that, it's almost like a reset, and some countries will do well out of it and some countries will do worse from it, and powers will start to shift? Like we're seeing, I guess, big shifts in what's happening in America, and we're seeing a country like ourselves in a little corner of the world doing quite well out of it. Do you think it's like a reset, and some countries will do well and not others?
So I think the issue with the geopolitics, and we should be very worried about this. When you have a major disruption, people get angry, they vote for people who are liable to do silly things, and people get hurt. And that, I think, is very much underway at the moment. I mean, you only have to look at the way that power in China has been consolidated since the GFC. They're now using COVID as an excuse to crack down on Hong Kong. The Americans have elected a guy that, if you took him seriously, the things that he routinely says about other countries would be the kinds of things that in the past have led to wars, saying that it's China's fault and they lied to us and all that. And then you look around Europe, you've got these, populist parties that have some pretty dark sort of views being elected. So, you've got a real chance that this whole sort of nice environment that most New Zealanders kind of under 70 are used to, where nothing really bad ever happens. There's no law that says it has to be that way. And we should be really worried about geopolitics, our relationship with China, and the major powers' relationships with each other. Because I think one thing about a disruption like this, I mean, look what happened with the Depression. Things got very nasty very quick.
Yeah, it's a very good point you raised. Do you think, I suppose New Zealanders are really good at coming together collectively, and we almost put politics to a side in a time like this, and we think about communities and people who have been made redundant, or their businesses aren't doing so well, and we sort of band together to volunteer and help each other along. What do you think it is about New Zealand that makes us so, and why isn't it like that in the rest of the world? I think it's a major problem. Personally, I think we as humans do better when we function as a collective. This might sound airy-fairy, but it seems quite unique to New Zealand, considering the loud noises that are going on around the world at the moment.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I think basically you witness random acts of kindness on your street, but when you learn about other countries, you're seeing all the bad things that make the news in their media.
That's true.
You know, the idea that Americans are not kind. I mean, they're incredibly kind people. I've now visited about 28 states or something. Canadians, Australians, most Europeans are incredibly kind. You know, if you've spent some time with the local Chinese community in Auckland, I mean, they're very thoughtful people. So you know, the idea that there's no kindness, it's somehow expressed in different ways. So you know, that's true, but the idea that there is you know, something different about New Zealand, I don't think is quite true. I do think that you know, this whole debate or this whole event has shown something about us that I'm a bit worried about, how easily we've accepted such a blunt authoritarian approach from government. We've been very unwilling to question, and New Zealanders not only have they been unwilling to question, but they've been really enthusiastic about snitching on each other and generally beating up on anyone that questions the official party line. So I'd always thought New Zealanders, you know, we sort of had that tradition of English liberalism and freedom and individual liberty, but actually so quickly we've become a nation of narcs and become prepared to really beat up on and denigrate alternative points of view. And even you look at you know, in the scientific community, there's this small group of academics the government relies upon that, you know, are kind of used to denigrate people that express alternative views. And so I just look at like COC Wiles' criticisms of the Plan B group. I mean, her criticisms are just so obviously stupid. She's not making them for scientific reasons. She's making them for populist reasons, and I think that's a real shame.
Ties in quite nicely to John's question. How does a society that has learned to rely too heavily on the government to get things done transition to a place where individualism and personal responsibility are valued? Thanks, John.
Well, there's really good examples of this. You know, you look at Germany after World War II. I mean, they obviously had you know, one of the worst experiments in government in human history, and yet they became a very free and liberal society, or West Germany did anyway, you know, shortly after that, and that became the fastest growing economy in Europe by a long shot. So that was really you know, a good example. You look at Estonia from 1992 onwards; they were freed from being part of the Soviet Union, and again introduced good policy, grew very rapidly. Hong Kong's another example. Singapore's another example. So you know, mostly these small states, once they're liberated from excessive government, if they put the right rules of the game in place, have government that does the things that are necessary for government to do, and there's certainly some, then you can get a really rapid growth. And then, of course, people say, oh, that's like an economic miracle. You know, it's the Asian tiger economy, it's the Celtic tiger economy, you know, it's Estonia, whatever. The Japanese economic miracle is not a miracle. It's perfectly predictable. The problem is that most countries, most of the time, have big government and stupid policies, and nothing much happens. And then every now and then you get the policy settings right, and you know, become the richest country in the world in a short period of time. We just got to be more like that.
A question from Greg Arthur next. David, do you see a tax on free speech coming in line with what you said before about Kiwis being so compliant to authority?
Yeah, I mean, it's really shocked and horrified me that actually the way that so many of my fellow New Zealanders have responded to this crisis. there was some idiot on another feed that I was doing a podcast like this, and he was saying, "I don't mind if it costs you." It's like, so he does care about an individual and their concerns, but only his, not yours. I just think, what an idiot. So there's too much of that attitude of people highly opinionated, but their opinion is that you should shut up, and that's very scary. When it comes to free speech, I mean, there's kind of two things going on in the world right now. One is government censorship, which we're opposed to, obviously. But the other is this kind of soft bullying censorship that goes on, where we just don't have the ability to have difficult conversations anymore, because people immediately say, oh, if you disagree with me, then you must dislike the type of person that I am, or, it's not fair, or you're oppressing me or something. So, at one level, do we want to see government legislation around speech? I think it's now very unlikely that we're going to see it before the election. They're just running out of time to introduce and pass that legislation anyway. So in a way, I guess, coronavirus has probably saved us from hate speech legislation, at least for now. On the other hand, I don't know what you do about that soft censorship, that sort of cultural attitude that we don't like people who think differently. It's a real problem for New Zealand. People say that we have a tall poppy syndrome. That's not true. We love tall poppies. We love like the best flanker in the world, Richie McCaw, or Sam Cane, or whoever. What we hate is different poppies. Our objection is not to people that are really good at doing things that we approve of. Our objection is to people that do things we disapprove of. And we've got to somehow get over that in New Zealand, because it's the dark underbelly of our culture.
Do you think the soft bullying is more prevalent here than it is globally, or is sort of a global trend?
I don't know. I mean, the only way to answer that is if you really have some sort of controlled study of how people act in different places. And look, I suspect that New Zealand's probably actually one of the better places in the world. You try to go to some countries, and even having a different religion from the state sanctioned religion, you get beaten up for. And some people really intolerant of your sexuality. Some countries still think that women are, have a different set of rights. So, I mean, we're a lot more tolerant on religion, sexuality, gender, and race for that matter. I mean, you even go to Australia, they're so racist over there. So, I think we're probably in a pretty good space for the most part, but we're still far too intolerant of a diversity of ideas, and that is the dark underbelly of our country.
We're just running short on time, so just to close up the podcast, have you got any last thoughts for the New Zealand public as we sign off?
Oh, look, we as a country get to choose our pathway. Just like businesses, just like individuals and families, we actually have choices about the direction that we take. And broadly, the choice is we can follow what other countries who have found themselves in, real ruin have done, and that is to have, free markets, limited government, be open to trade, investment, and immigration, get the skills and the capital, and become a place where things just grow and you become very wealthy very quickly. There's all manner of examples of that. Your Hong Kongs, your Singapores, your West Germanys, your Estonias. We can be open to markets and grow, or we can be really stupid and use this as an example or an opportunity to have big government and to promote the kind of interventionist policies that have failed in New Zealand's past and failed in countries around the world wherever they've been tried. So that broadly is the choice. And ACT, of course, believes in freedom. We believe in the inherent dignity of the individual, and that's why we can't support those kinds of collectivist policies. We stand up for individual and personal freedom.
Thanks so much, David. If someone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best avenue to do that?
Oh, look, just whatever is the best channel for that person. So, look, I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. You can email me at my parliamentary address. So my Facebook has the biggest following, but I just invite people to use the channel that's best for them, because I'm on most of them.
Thanks so much, David, for coming on. I know it's a really busy time for you.
Hey,
so
thank you, Jace.
Really privileged that you could jump on the Daily Jace live show, and keep up the good work. I know it's a busy time for all on the committee.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. Thanks everyone for watching.
See you, David.